Hi, I'm Chris Green, the History Chap, telling forgotten stories from British history. Now, most of you will know that Hong Kong was a British Crown colony. Many of you might even remember it being handed back to China in 1997. But did you know Britain handed back another port to China in 1930? Despite the Union flag flying from its flagpole, Royal Navy warships docking in its harbour, and plans to turn it into the Far East version of the Torquay Riviera, you've probably never even heard of it. So, let me tell you the story of Weihaiwei, Britain's forgotten naval base in China. The port of Weihaiwei, now called Weihai, lies about 400 miles east of Beijing. It was once seen by the British as the northern sister to their colony at Hong Kong, over 1,100 miles to the south. Now, to understand why Britain ever wanted Weihaiwei, we need to step back to the 1890s and what historians call the Scramble for China. Unlike the Scramble for Africa, China wasn't being carved up into colonies by other empires. It was being dissected through spheres of influence and lease agreements, which technically kept China intact, but gave the Europeans and the Japanese and even the Americans considerable rights in and control over parts of the country. The catalyst for the Scramble was the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895. Japan's stunning victory shocked the world and left China's naval base at Weihaiwei in Japanese hands. That opened the floodgates for other imperial powers to take advantage of the weakened Chinese to pursue their own agendas in what modern Chinese refer to as unequal treaties. In 1898, France secured Guangzhou Bay in the south, whilst in the north, apart from the presence of the victorious Japanese, the Russians gained control of Port Arthur and the Germans leased Qingdao on the Shandong Peninsula. Despite having control of Hong Kong in the south, Britain suddenly found herself at a disadvantage in the north, as all her main European rivals were getting in on the act. How could she avoid missing out in the north of China? Here's where it gets interesting. In return for a massive indemnity from China and gaining influence in Korea, the Japanese agreed to return the port of Weihaiwei to China. But waiting eagerly in the wings were the British. And once more, their strategy was being driven by the desire to check the growth of the Russian Empire. The Russians' new Tsar, 27-year-old Nicholas II, had dreams of a Russian Empire extending far across Asia into China itself. As part of that ambition, the Russians had negotiated a 25-year lease from the Chinese for Port Arthur, positioned on the north side of the Bohai Sea, the main maritime route to Beijing. It put them in a powerful position in northern China. Aware that her influence was limited to southern China, thanks to Hong Kong, and wary of losing any competitive position against her rivals, Britain negotiated a similar 25-year lease for Weihaiwei directly across the bay from Port Arthur. It was an ideal addition to the Royal Navy's China station, based further south at Hong Kong and Singapore, and in doing so, she had also countered Russian maritime access to Beijing in the process. But Russian control of Port Arthur didn't last long, and it had nothing to do with Great Britain. In 1904, the Russo-Japanese War broke out, which led to a humiliating defeat for the Russians. Port Arthur was captured after a long siege, and the Japanese negotiated their own 25-year lease on the base and its hinterland from China. With this change in situation, and with an eye on the growing German naval base in nearby Qingdao, the British now renegotiated their own lease on Weihaiwei, with an end date of 1930. The British had taken possession of the territory, hoisting the Union flag, on the 24th of May, 1898. The senior British official, the Commissioner, adopted the Union flag with the Imperial Chinese dragon in the centre as his own personal standard. The leased area was about 288 square miles in total and had a population of about 150,000. It also included the small island of Liaogong, just over 2 miles off the coast. The island had previously been the base of China's modern Beiyang fleet until its defeat in the war with Japan. As much as anything, it was this base that the British were interested in as the northern port of their China Station fleet, rather than the mainland, whose rugged hills, some rising to about 1,600 feet, and cultivated valleys merely acted as a buffer zone to protect the naval base. The British developed a capital, Port Edward, on the mainland, next to the Chinese walled city, the latter inhabited by about 2,000 people. Port Edward was always a modest settlement. The British population always remained small, and apart from Port Edward, many resided on Liaogong Island. The British constructed their own English-style homes, with a twist of Oriental thrown in, along with roads, a government building, churches, tennis courts, a golf course, and a post office. A little piece of England in northern China. Interestingly, Weihaiwei never had its own stamps or currency. In the latter case, Chinese and Hong Kong currencies were the common methods of transaction, whilst any letters sent from the post office either used Hong Kong or even British stamps, simply overprinted with the word Weihaiwei. That is indicative of how the British saw this transitory territory. Whilst initially obtained as a naval base, naval bases cost money, and the British government, even before the First World War, were loath to invest sums in large capital projects which would, by treaty agreement, be handed back to China in the non-too-distant future. And anyway, a survey by the Royal Engineers concluded that the harbour, whilst providing a good anchorage with a depth of about 45 feet of water, was not big enough for a large fleet of warships. So, whilst the Royal Navy regularly docked at Weihaiwei, it would always be a substation, not a home for a main fleet. Now, you might be thinking, surely this is just another British colony. After all, Britain ran it, British officials governed it, and the Union Jack flew over it. But legally, Weihaiwei was something almost entirely unique in the British Empire. Unlike other colonies, which were governed under the British Settlements Act of 1887, Weihaiwei was administered under the Foreign Jurisdiction Act of 1890. Now, this might sound like legal nitpicking, but it was fundamentally different. The Foreign Jurisdiction Act was designed for Britain's extraterritorial rights in places like China and Japan, temporary arrangements where Britain exercised jurisdiction over British subjects in foreign territory, but on the understanding that it was not forever. What this meant in practice was that China never surrendered sovereignty over Weihaiwei. The territory remained Chinese soil with Chinese subjects under Chinese law, except where Britain exercised its exclusive jurisdiction over its own citizens. It was a legal compromise that created something neither colony nor protectorate, inside the British Empire, but only just. It was always a short-term lease from China. The administration reflected this ambiguity. While Hong Kong was governed by a governor appointed by the Crown, Weihaiwei was run by a mere commissioner. Initially, as the whole reason for the lease was to secure a naval base, the territory was run by Admiral Sir Edward Seymour in his capacity as Commander-in-Chief China Station. But within a year, control had passed to the War Office, and then in 1901 to the Colonial Office, a sure sign that nobody wanted responsibility or knew what to do with this latest addition to the empire. The first civilian commissioner, appointed in 1901, was James Stuart Lockhart, a 20-year-old veteran of Hong Kong's colonial service. Now, whilst many saw it as a temporary, borrowed territory that was a drain on British finances, Lockhart had grand plans. He wanted to develop Weihaiwei as a health resort, a sort of Torquay of the Far East. The Royal Navy bought into his idea and began using it as a summer retreat for its personnel, away from the humidity of Hong Kong. By 1910, Weihaiwei had bathing huts on its beaches and was hosting tennis tournaments, boat races and garden parties that would have been quite familiar to anyone from an English seaside town. The British community never exceeded a few hundred souls, mostly officials, military personnel and their families. They lived in a curious bubble, enjoying the benefits of a temperate climate, whilst governing a territory that most of them suspected was ultimately pointless. The Chinese population, meanwhile, lived, well, much as they always had. Chinese magistrates continued to handle most local disputes, Chinese customs prevailed, and the vast majority of inhabitants saw little change in their daily lives. It was imperialism, with a very soft touch indeed. Commissioner Lockhart also changed the flag of the territory. He persuaded the British government that it was inappropriate to use the symbol of another country, the Imperial Dragon of China, on a British flag, and suggested a pair of Mandarin ducks instead. These same ducks were then adopted for the flag of Weihaiwei, which was used from 1903 until the end of British rule. An interesting story maybe, but Weihaiwei's most fascinating chapter involves its military forces. In 1898, recognising that the territory needed defending, the British raised the first Chinese regiment, also known as the Weihaiwei Regiment, consisting of Chinese soldiers from the local Shandong province, commanded by British officers and NCOs. The regiment was the brainchild of Indian Army commander Major Hamilton Bower, who became its first commandant. Aged 41, Bower had been born at Portsea in Hampshire before joining the Indian Army. During the early 1890s, he had travelled extensively in Tibet and Chinese Turkestan, the very western areas of China, earning special recognition from the Royal Geographical Society. Prior to his appointment as the founding commander of the 1st Chinese Regiment, he had served in General Kitchener's Dongola expedition in Sudan. By 1900, the 1st Chinese Regiment consisted of 420 men, organised into 7 companies, and by all accounts, it was an excellent unit, praised for its drill, its military appearance, and marksmanship. But then came the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, and the regiment faced the ultimate test. The Boxers, a secret society known as the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, had launched a violent campaign to drive out all foreigners from China. The 1st Chinese Regiment found itself in a peculiar position of Chinese soldiers serving under British command, fighting against their own countrymen. It says something about the unit's discipline that while some men deserted rather than fight their fellow countrymen, 2/3 stayed with their British officers. When the foreign legations were besieged in Beijing, or Peking as it was called in the West, in June 1900, Admiral Seymour was placed in command of an 8-nation army tasked with their rescue. The following month, 200 men of the regiment, led by Boer, joined the international force that stormed the vital city of Tianjin. Fighting alongside US Marines commanded by Smedley Butler, they distinguished themselves in a hard-fought battle. The cost was heavy to the regiment. 2 British officers and 21 Chinese NCOs and men were killed, along with many more wounded. For bravery during the battle, Sergeant Ji Dian-Kui was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, the DCM, after leading half a company of men without a European officer and charging an enemy position. In a separate action at the same battle, a British NCO, Colour Sergeant Purdon, was also awarded the DCM. The regiment's courage was recognised with a unique honour: permission to wear cap badges depicting the Drum Tower of Tianjin, commemorating their role in the city's capture. Fittingly, in 1902, a contingent from the regiment, consisting of 1 British Sergeant Major and 12 Chinese soldiers, travelled to London to participate in King Edward VII's coronation procession. But the regiment's moment of glory in the Boxer Rebellion also sealed its fate. After the Boxers were defeated, the British government decided that maintaining a Chinese regiment was an unnecessary expense, and it was disbanded in 1906. 3 NCOs and 55 men were retained to form the Weihaiwei police force. Others joined the railway police protecting the Imperial railways in northern China. The First World War brought Weihaiwei its second moment of historical significance. By 1916, the British Army desperately needed manpower, not for fighting, but for the massive logistic operations behind the Western Front. The solution was the Chinese Labour Corps, and Weihaiwei became its primary recruiting ground. The scheme was the brainchild of Thomas J. Bourne, a former railway engineer who'd worked in China for 28 years. Arriving at Weihaiwei in October 1916, Bourne turned to 2 former officers of the 1st Chinese Regiment, Colonel Brian Charles Fairfax, who had served as a lieutenant in the Boxer Rebellion, and the now promoted Colonel Purdon, DCM. These men understood the potential and the challenges of working with Chinese personnel. The operation was extraordinary in its scale and efficiency. 100,000 Chinese volunteers, driven by poverty and attracted by generous wages, underwent medical examinations, signed contracts, and were shipped via the Pacific and across Canada to France. The first transport, carrying 1,088 labourers, sailed from Weihaiwei in January 1917. Now, these men weren't soldiers. China wasn't officially at war with Germany until August 1917. They performed the back-breaking work that kept the British Army functioning, digging trenches, building roads, clearing battlefields, and handling supplies. The Chinese Labour Corps was a remarkable success, and a little-known story, but it came at a huge human cost. Thousands died from disease, accidents, and occasional enemy fire. For Weihaiwei, the Labour Corps represented its greatest contribution to the British Empire, not as a commercial enterprise, strategic military outpost, or summer playground, but as a recruiting ground for Chinese labour. And as if to reinforce that point, in 1922, during the Seamen's Strike in Hong Kong, 50 men were specially recruited from Weihaiwei to join the Royal Hong Kong Police. Having lived far from Hong Kong, there was little chance that they would have divided loyalties that the British feared some of the local Hong Kong police might have. As it was, the strike was settled very much in the sailors' favour, but that's another story. And speaking of Hong Kong, why did Weihaiwei never become the Hong Kong of the North? The answer lies in a combination of geography, politics and economics. Geographically, Weihaiwei was isolated. Unlike Hong Kong, which sat astride the main shipping routes in southern China, Weihaiwei was a cul-de-sac surrounded by Shandong province, which was in Germany's sphere of influence, and, after 1918, Japan's. With no commercial hinterland, British merchants found it easier and more profitable to trade through established ports elsewhere in China than to develop a new one from scratch. Unlike Hong Kong, where British sovereignty was absolute, Weihaiwei's future was limited, and both the British government and British investors were reluctant to commit capital to a territory that had a short shelf life with an uncertain future beyond. Economically, Weihaiwei was a drain on British resources. In most years, the expenditure of running the territory exceeded the revenues, the deficits being made good by grants from the British taxpayer. The hoped-for development as a health resort attracted some British officials, but hardly justified the expense of maintaining the territory. And the whole reason Britain had taken on the lease was to provide an additional port for the Royal Navy's China station. Yet, even inheriting the old Chinese Navy facilities, the port needed considerable investment to bring it up to the standards of the docks at Hong Kong, let alone Singapore. Quite frankly, the British government had neither the cash nor the will to make that sort of investment, especially in light of that short-term lease that might not be renewed. And if it was renewed, did northern China still interest the British? The short answer was no. So, whilst Royal Navy ships regularly visited Weihaiwei and the personnel spent their summers there, it was always the lesser of the China station ports. Stuck out on a limb over 1,000 miles from the nearest British colony, Hong Kong, its isolation made it increasingly a white elephant. In 1921, after a tenure lasting almost 2 decades, Sir James Lockhart stepped down as commissioner. With the end of the lease in sight, there now followed 3 commissioners in 9 years. The last, appointed in 1927, was Sir Reginald Fleming Johnston. Johnston had for 5 years after the First World War been the tutor to the last Emperor of China. He was played by Peter O'Toole in the 1987 film The Last Emperor. In 1930, the 25-year lease ran out. In October 1930, in a ceremony that attracted little attention, the British flag was lowered for the last time, and Weihaiwei was returned to Chinese control. The Chinese government immediately leased just Liaozhong Island with its naval base back to Britain until 1940. But apart from a skeleton garrison and passing Royal Naval vessels, there was no British presence on the island. It was off the island that in 1931 a submarine, HMS Poseidon, collided with a Chinese merchant vessel and sank. 21 members of the crew died and were buried in a cemetery on the island. The rest of the crew were picked up by nearby Royal Navy vessels, also operating out of Weihaiwei. These included the first purpose-built British aircraft carrier, HMS Hermes. No, not the one you might remember from the Falklands War. This one, commissioned in 1924, was sunk in the Bay of Bengal by the Japanese in 1942. So, what happened to Weihaiwei after the British left? Well, the territory was integrated into the Republic of China, but its troubles were far from over. In 1938, Japanese forces occupied the mainland part of the territory. With that occupation just across the bay, the Royal Navy ceased to use Liaozhong Island for the final 2 years of their lease. On the 1st of October 1940, considering that the British 10-year lease had expired, the Japanese occupied the island, unopposed. Their occupation lasted until 1945. Thereafter, it was captured by communist forces during the Chinese Civil War. Today, Weihaiwei is a thriving city in Shandong province, known for its fishing industry and as a health resort, ironically fulfilling Commissioner Lockhart's vision a century earlier. Few traces of the British period remain. The naval cemetery where the graves of the crew from HMS Poseidon lay is overgrown, and many of the gravestones have been removed and used in local building projects. Weihaiwei might very well be one of the British Empire's most forgotten territories. It came under British control without fanfare, and then, without a war or a revolt, it simply and quietly reverted back to China without fanfare too. Interestingly, back in 1909, the then Governor of Hong Kong, Sir Frederick Lugard, who would in a few years' time become the first Governor-General of Nigeria, actually proposed handing Weihaiwei back to China in return for perpetual control of the new territories in mainland Hong Kong. Whilst Hong Kong Island had been ceded in perpetuity to Great Britain in the 1840s, and the tip of Kowloon Peninsula likewise in the 1860s, the new territories, which comprised 86% of the Crown Colony of Hong Kong, were in 1898 merely leased to Britain for 99 years. It was the expiry of that lease that led the British government to conclude that holding the island by itself was unsustainable, resulting in the whole of Hong Kong being handed over to China in 1997. Lugard's idea didn't gain any support in London, but had it done so, it presents the tantalising thought that Hong Kong could very well still be British to this day. Well, I hope you enjoyed finding out about that little-known story from the British Empire. In fact, why not check out my other episodes about the British in China, including 55 Days in Peking during the Boxer Rising and the First Opium War. A big thanks to all my patrons and members, in particular Leslie Bowring, David McPherson, Mehdi and Joanne Lusher, and you can join them supporting my channel in the description below. I'm Chris Green, the History Chap. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.